Hello, everyone. Tonight's episode is about a word that sounds like a new energy drink flavor, but it's actually a serious idea: sociocracy. Most of us grew up thinking democracy. Democracy meaning voting every few years and then watching institutions do whatever they were going to do anyway. Sociocracy starts from a different premise. If we want democracy, it has to live where decisions actually happen in organizations, movements, workplaces, committees, coalitions, and community groups. At its core, sociocracy is a way of governing together that's designed to be practical, humane, and surprisingly efficient. It usually rests on a few simple pillars: consent based decisions. Not everyone must love it, but no one has reasoned objection that this will harm the group or block its aims. Number two, circles, teams, or committees with clear aims and clear authority to decide within their domain. Three, roles with accountability. Responsibilities aren't vague, they're named, owned, and reviewed. Feedback loops. Decisions aren't sacred tablets, they're tested, evaluated, and improved in regular review cycles. In plain language, sociocracy tries to solve the problem every movement eventually hits. How do we stay democratic without becoming chaotic, slow, or dominated by the loudest people in the room? How do we build structures that outlast a moment of outrage and become a long-term vehicle for change? And current events makes this point painfully relevant. We're watching political systems crack under pressure: climate breakdown, mass disinformation, widening inequality, authoritarian drift, a public that doesn't trust institutions, and movements that are passionate but often fragile, splintering over tactics, identity, and burnout. The question isn't whether people care, it's whether we have the structures to turn care into coordinated power. So tonight, we're not just asking what is sociocracy, we're asking, can it help us organize in a way that's resilient, ethical, and effective right now?
Thank you so much for that great introduction, Wissam.
Yeah. So I am your host, Wissam Charafeddine, and joining me is Henry Pratt, a veteran of campaigns from Bernie 2016 to state and local races, longtime member of the Campaign Workers Guild, and an Extinction Rebellion activist who spent years in earned media and movement communications. You gotta tell us what that means, Henry. And Henry has one foot in the machine and one foot in the street, which is exactly where you want someone if you're going to talk about building systems that actually work. So we'll start with Henry introducing himself a little bit more than I did and talking to us about sociocracy and what can it mean to us.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. So I've been an activist and a electoral campaigner for a long time. I work with different candidates who are running for often local offices like city council, mayor's race, school boards, things like that. And then I work in kind of climate activism on the side and help people make, more efficient, actions and things like that to shift the conversation. And a big part of that, what you mentioned, was earned media. So that's essentially media that you don't pay for. It's not advertising or things like that. It's coverage in newspapers, from influencers, things like that, because people look at your ideas and they think like, whoa, that's cool, I want to talk about this, or what you do is newsworthy, and people want to share that and bring that out to other people. So it's a great way to move into different kind of conversation sectors and things like that. And I first really got involved in sociocracy actually a little bit through that, because that requires a lot of different kinds of complex decision making. It requires talking to a lot of different experts and incorporating their input into making sure that you are making actions doing things that are, highly visible and effective. And we required the tools to do that and to listen to each other. So I went out and kind of got trained off of that.
Great. So is it so you're part of an organization that promotes sociocracy?
Yes. So I'm part of an organization called Sociocracy for All, which is a international nonprofit, and it helps different organizations, whether they be businesses, schools, nonprofits, activist groups and movements, intentional communities, which is a huge one. A lot of different, co-housing or eco villages or things like that. Implement sociocracy as their decision-making method, and it basically trains people to better understand sociocracy and to lead and support their own implementations in groups that they're a part of, or to support others in kind of building salience and understanding of that decision. A great thing about sociocracy is it's not owned by like one corporation. Like it's not like, this is like Jeff's decision-making method, and if you want to do this, you have to go talk to Jeff and Jeff will train you. There are a lot of people who know sociocracy and can help you understand it. And give you the tools to spread that.
When was this idea born? Do you know a little bit of the history of sociocracy?
Yeah, so it kind of comes out of the 1980s with, and I'm going to say this name wrong, but Gerard Edinburgh, who is a engineer, and he was also familiar with Quaker decision-making methods. So Quaker religious communities have used consensus-based decision-making. And Gerard, as an engineer, was also very familiar with system science, which takes us into the world of, biology and ecosystems and mutuality, where different sorts of species and animals and things like that interact to everyone's benefit. And things can grow kind of more complex over time and take on emergent behaviors, so things that don't even seem possible given the sum of their parts. And so he was basically looking for a way to combine what his field was with kind of his own familiarity with consensus from there. But it really doesn't belong to that. Obviously, consensus is a huge decision-making tradition that's been very prevalent in the world, all around for a very, very long time in indigenous communities. And so it's much bigger than that one guy, and he didn't kind of seek to first put it out there or anything like that. He just sought to put some kind of principles together.
Okay, and how was it established in the United States?
Well, it's been very, there's no kind of like establishment of it. There's actually an international body that if you do get trained enough and do certain things, you could be like a consultant in it and essentially be hired by different communities and companies. And there is a professional association internationally that certifies people to do that. But it is a very international movement, especially because a lot of these things that we've been talking about, whether that's activist groups or intentional communities or things like that, these are ideas that are all over the world. The UK was the birthplace of, a lot of modern co-op movements as we think of them. Intentional communities are huge on every single continent. And same thing with these ideas, especially how we talk about businesses and things like that. Decision-making in businesses and other kinds of commercial corporations is a big kind of discussion topic in business in a lot of different countries, especially in Southern Africa and South America and Northern Europe, where there is a lot of different thinking on how can we decide better and work together better and share power and things like that. That movement also exists in the United States a little bit. If you're ever familiar with Agile, the software decision-making system, that's a movement in this sort of more participatory space at work. So it is very much an international movement. Same thing with activist groups. Extinction Rebellion was started in Europe. It's now on every single continent. And I got involved with it in America after it had been quite big in the United Kingdom and in Asia and elsewhere. We were kind of latecomers to it, and that's where I was introduced to the idea.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Extinction Rebellion?
Sure. So that's an international nonviolent direct action movement to basically force people to reckon with the challenges of the climate crisis. It has kind of three key pillars. Tell the truth, which is a really big one. We feel that different news organizations and governments are not honest about the risks of climate, how close we are to tipping points and thresholds, which could make habitable life as we know it very, very difficult for us. The scale of desertification that is going on, the scale of internal migration in countries that are most affected by the climate crisis. We have entire countries in the South Pacific who are, disappearing due to sea level rise. So getting people to grapple with that as an existential issue. The second part of that is Act Now, which is basically committing to net zero into transition methods. Extinction Rebellion was the big reason why the United Kingdom passed a net zero initiative under a conservative government. Here in America, we were responsible for the New York City Council declaring a climate emergency back in 2020. And then the third piece of that is citizens' assemblies. So it's participatory democracy, which is always part of that movement, and bringing more people's voices into governance and decision making. So citizens' assemblies are now called civic juries as well in some countries. They've been used for a long time to help settle thorny issues, such as in Ireland. They used it to settle the question of abortion rights in a majority Catholic country. And they require basically input from experts, sortitions. So just like how you would get selected for jury duty, random sample of people across opinions and ideologies and backgrounds to make up a representative sample of your community. They're brought together to make a decision. And this also seems something very foreign to us here in America, but it's actually used quite a bit. If anyone is familiar with traffic problems in Medford, Oregon, the Medford City Council brought together a citizens' assembly to try to figure out a way to get out of that. So it's actually a tool that's used quite a bit, and we're trying to get that to be used by the climate crisis, because by governments to lead us out of the climate crisis, because we believe that people understand the nature of this emergency and what needs to be done for us to come together far better than a bunch of bickering politicians do.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So going back to Sociocracy, what distinguishes that methodology from other methodologies that are used within similar organizations, political movements, social organizations, environmental organizations? What did you find personally in Sociocracy that made it stand out?
Yeah, so I actually have a little bit of a bigger answer to this. Forgive me in advance. Believe it or not, you're a lot more familiar with governance than you kind of think. If you've ever asked your family where you're gonna get takeout from tonight, that's a big form of decision making. It often happens by consensus, everyone agreeing we're gonna go to one place. And if you've ever been part of any company, any civil society group, any activist group, any nonprofit, any PTA, anything like that, you've encountered as well lots of different forms of governance, people who put things together, people who organize meetings, how you decide who does what, how roles are put down, oftentimes policies, so decisions that come up over and over again. There may be something of this is how we deal with petty cash, or this is how we deal with donations, or this is how we do a bake sale. All those things are we don't really think of them as a structure, but they're things we encounter all the time. every day. And a lot of decisions, whether they're made by everybody all together in one meeting, like a whole group consensus, like, where you're going to eat as a family, or whether they're made by, some CEO high up in a far tower far away with, lightning and winged monkeys flying around it. They often kind of struggle with the same sort of issues. So they can leave people feeling kind of disempowered, like, I had such a better idea for that. Why did nobody ask me? Or I felt like, I couldn't speak up and bring that forward. And indeed, if you think back to school, there were always people who were raising their hands about everything, whether they knew the answer or not. And a lot of people who knew the answer who didn't raise their hands. People are wired differently and they participate differently. They're quite arbitrary. We see a lot of examples of this out in the real world, where decisions are made and they just don't make a lot of sense. And because they clearly didn't talk to anyone. I know I worked for a convenience store in college, and we would get constant new promotions and menu items, and our customers would, be like, what the hell is this? This I don't like this. This isn't mine. Or, our favorite menu item would be taken away at a moment's whim. Or you just need to look at like the constant issues with Starbucks and their shift to sugary drinks, which I guess makes sense on paper. More people coming in, they're expensive. They kind of addict people because of the sugar content. But then when you think about all the people who were going to Starbucks at their lunch hour to buy a coffee or to have a meeting, and suddenly they're stuck behind a bunch of middle schoolers putting up weird little coins on the counter and complaining. Nobody wants to be involved in that. And indeed, Starbucks is now trying to shift back away from that. And it was, hard for the baristas to manage. If you've ever talked to anyone who delivers food or a small business restaurant owner, they'll tell you the same thing. These different delivery apps, they're not dealt with how restaurants deliver orders, think about things, move items from the counter to the kitchen, take payment, things like that. So a lot of decisions disconnected from the people who are most affected by it. And you just need to look at our democracy as well to understand that. And then the third thing is that decisions take a very, very long time. Again, I'm going to use kind of the business metaphor here because we all at least have some interaction with the business on the day-to-day life. So it's a pretty kind of shared understanding. Toys R Us did not see a shift to online buying. It no longer exists. Blockbuster didn't, was renting out things physically. They had a chance to buy Netflix. They turned that down. If they had kind of asked their employees, hey, what do, customers, think, it would have been a very different story. So those are three kind of issues with decision-making that I kind of saw Sociocracy as solving. So I'm a little bit familiar with consensus too. And I want to say something about this because we often think of that as the most egalitarian and inclusive form of governance, which on paper, it kind of sounds like, and it sounds like a good way to get to a compromise. But there's different types of compromises. There is, you have an idea of how things are, and I have an idea of how things are, and we take elements of both of our ideas and we bring them together to move something forward. And then there's also, we're just going to water everything down, like a climate treaty or an international arms treaty, until everyone can agree to it, because it actually really doesn't do much on beyond, just a sentence on paper. And unfortunately, what I was seeing with some groups that were using consensus is that people were kind of moderating what they wanted to happen or simplifying what they wanted to happen over and over again to make it more palatable to everyone. So people didn't feel like their ideas were being able to come forward and be part of that. And so with Sociocracy, there was this idea of rounds where everyone in a group, for maybe a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, shares what they think about a topic. And then the proposal is revised with those people's ideas. And to me, that kind of answered a lot of this, decision-making being, not including my voice, or decision-making kind of being something where we're not actually addressing the real issue, but we're just kind of doing something everyone can agree to right now. And the second piece of that, the arbitrariness. Sociocracy has this big principle of feedback where you look at who is most affected by a decision, and you have to reach out to them. So just because your group is empowered to make that decision, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't solicit feedback. I think a good example of this is I did a case study on a housing community in Oregon once, and they had a gardening pod that was in charge of deciding everything that they would plant. And this gardening pod looked at the laws, they looked at what their members wanted to plant, and they decided to plant a bunch of marijuana plants on the property. They were empowered to make that decision, and that was great, but it ended up being quite arbitrary and counterproductive because they didn't talk to any of the parents about how they would feel with their kids, running around on that lawn and then encountering marijuana plants. So you always have to kind of talk to who the key stakeholders are in a decision, whether that be people who interface with what you're doing, whether that be people you're in partnership with, whether that be your own members, whether that be the person who's the expert in that, who's coming into this group. And then the third thing is it taking a long time. Oftentimes, in bigger organizations, things have to kind of go all the way up the chain, or you have to wait until you can have a meeting where you can bring everyone together to have a conversation. And that can kind of stall rapid response and things like that. Coming from a communications background, we often had a lot of different issues where we needed to respond to something right now. I mean, I think a big example of this is I used to work for this British MP, and during that time was when the Me Too movement had kind of hit its height, and there were big scandals. We had the TV on, the live Parliament TV on, and she appeared on the TV because she had left the main entrance to the building where all the reporters were. And they asked her, hey, what do you think of all this Me Too stuff that's going on? And she basically alleged that there was another person who hadn't been talked about in this conversation who had harassed her, but then she refused to name that person. And then quickly, every single one of the phones in the office rings up and people are like, hey, this is so-and-so with The Guardian. We have a list of 40 different people who this could be because they were, MPs at this time, and blah, 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 blah. If you don't tell us now who this person is, we're just going to run the story. And we're like trying to get a hold of her. She's on a train somewhere. There's all sorts of situations like that happen in communications, and especially in crisis communications where things move so fast, where you need to be empowered to make decisions and to know what's best. So Sociocracy, by having these specializations and domains and people being able to make decisions within that, broadly within that domain, and to feel empowered to, gives a lot of ability to respond and adapt to things a lot faster.
So what would you say the main difference between sociocracy and consensus?
Yeah, so in one sense, it's a little bit tricky because sociocracy is a set of decision-making principles and consensus is the way you make a decision. So, but there is a method called whole group consensus, which is how most consensus organizations operate, where you get everyone together in a room and try to come to consensus on a decision, or you have different people delegated to make a proposal and then they bring it back and then people see consensus on it. Sociocracy is different in that you have an organization and you break it up into manageable teams. So teams of about 10 to 12 people max. So everyone can kind of have an opportunity to share and meetings are productive. And each of those groups hold a piece of what the organization does. So at Extinction Rebellion, we have these big demands. We're launching, protests in the street. We're putting all this, communications content out there. We're doing all this art. We're involved with all these other different groups who are community organizing. So we may have an outreach group, which is responsible for the relationships with different groups. And we may have a media and messaging group, which is responsible for our social media and our newsletter and putting out press releases. And we may have a finance group, which they're responsible for fundraising and managing that budget. We may have a legal group who are liaising with lawyers and things like that and evaluating risk. So each group has a little bit of that broader truth that they make decisions within. And each of those groups has two different elements. They have an aim, which is the purpose of their group. We provide the communications for the movement, the story, the structure, the narrative. And they have a domain, which is just a list of everything they make decisions, the parameter, the scope of what they make decisions on. So we make decisions on everything having to do with social media, newsletter, earned media might be the domain for a press group. And decisions are based off of this threshold of tolerance. So in consensus, everyone tries to basically get to something which everyone likes. Like, I like this proposal, I agree with that. But you're always going to have people who are on different spectrums of it. You're always going to have one person who really likes one thing and another person who really likes another thing. And that's why there's so much compromise kind of inherent and involved. What Sociocracy does is they say that's not the test. Your preference for what should happen is not the test. The test is it good enough for now, safe enough to try? Is this something you can live with? And a good way to look at that is to say, does this hurt our purpose as a group, right? So if we are making a decision as a media and messaging group and we're going to do something that hurts our relationships with journalists, I think, that would be a good reason to object. Or is this beyond our aim? If we are the media and messaging group and we just try to make a decision about what budget software to be used, that would be someone saying, whoa, that's not our decision to make. And often in consensus, when somebody objects to something, it starts a process of reevaluating the proposal, asking people what they think, or oftentimes a brand new proposal, or oftentimes an end to the proposal. And we'd say, okay, we'll table that for now, and I'll talk to you offline or whatever, and let's move on to something else. But in Sociocracy, it's an opportunity to make it better because you can do a few different things. There's only a few different kind of ways to handle an objection. One of them is to basically just modify the proposal. So oftentimes in Sociocracy, decisions are made in meetings. People give proposal ideas to the facilitator. They put them down on the agenda. At the beginning of the meeting, everyone consents to that agenda, that this agenda is within my range of tolerance. And the facilitator presents each proposal. If somebody has a question, maybe the person whose proposal idea it is may answer the question to try to help build understanding. But the proposal kind of belongs to the group at that point. It's not like your proposal anymore. So it de-individualizes things. And then when there is an objection, like let's say we're going to do something that's going to harm these journalists. We say, why? Okay, so why are you objecting? And the person says, well, I think we shouldn't do this because this could end up happening. Or I think we shouldn't do this because, this specific bit of this document or proposal or whatever is going to be an issue. And then basically you do a round of ideas of like, okay, how can we change this proposal to make it better? And then the facilitator revises the proposal and tries to incorporate that objection. So if we're putting out a press release and the press release has curse words in it, and we know that's not going to run maybe in some different newspapers, somebody can object, say, hey, I have an issue. I think that's going to harm the ability of us to get this out there. Somebody might say, hey, let's look at some synonyms for those words, or let's take that out. And the facilitator might listen, after listening to what's been said in that round, say, okay, I'm revising the proposal to take out those curse words. Does everyone understand? The other thing is you can adjust the term of it. So if something is going to take effect for a year, you can say, why don't we take it to just takes effect for 6 months? And the other thing you can do is you can test it out. If someone's saying, hey, this website that we're going to launch, it's going to be really unpopular with everyone. It's going to hurt us all. We can say, well, okay, Why don't we see if that's true? Why don't we present the website to 10 of our members and see what their feedback is on it first? And then we'll see if that's really, really true. And then oftentimes there's a combination of kind of those free ways of dealing with an objection.
And then you have Robert's Rules of Order that pretty much does not really rely on consensus. It relies mainly on majority rule, and that's, I think, is the main difference between it and so you would say consensus, it tries to optimize unity, often at the cost of a speed, while sociocracy optimizes learning, inclusion, execution. It has a sense of agile in it, right? Because you try something and then you come back and you get the feedback and then you adjust, which is it's always appealing to me as an engineer. And Robert Rules optimizes order and fairness through procedures, and also basically relies on majority rule. Now, why do you think that Robert Rules of Order is? I don't have the exact statistic, but it is my impression that it is the most widely used within organizational structures.
Well, a big part of that is actually regulation. If anyone has ever tried to either set up a business, set up a nonprofit, set up an intentional community, whatever, they will realize that right from the very start, they have to interact with all sorts of different government agencies. These agencies want constitutions. They want an understanding of who's in charge. They want an understanding of how you're going to use money. The IRS wants to know what sort of tax status you're going to be. So there's like C3s and C4s and C6s and, all sorts of different, structures for groups, as well as, for-profit groups. They need to know how to collect tax, who your employees are, blah, blah, blah. And right there is baked into those things, elements of how your group is going to be structured. And oftentimes they ask for, we want to see a board, and we want to see, how you're going to make decisions. And people will use Robert's Rules of Order because that is the most common thing. And that's probably what they're used to, because they'll say, hey, we use Robert's Rules of Order at my PTA, or, hey, we use Robert's Rules of Order with my soccer group or whatever. And they'll bring that in to the conversation. And oftentimes it's suggested, or in some cases required. If you've ever tried to create, in the political party world, you try to create a political party in a state like New York, there's all these different rules of like, you have to have a committee in every single county, and committees needs to be set up this way and stuff. So suddenly there's all these mandations, and you're like, okay, well, let's just use what they're asking for. In the case of Extinction Rebellion, there's different groups that are nonprofits, and they have, the constitution, that is the legal structure of their board, and then they have an overlap on top of that is the sociocratic constitution. So that's one thing. The world orients you in one direction. The other thing is there's just a lot of material out there for Robert's Rules of Order that can help you understand it. And also people feel kind of safe and familiar with voting. A big thing in the politics movement space is the fact that every single government body uses Robert's Rules of Order to conduct a meeting. So it's very beneficial to understand Robert's Rules of Order.
Okay. Yeah, it is really a questionable thing when an organization is faced with choosing, procedures such as that, because there is something that they will lose and gain in each one of them. I feel like consensus can be effective, but only under low pressure, because achieving consensus is a very time-consuming process. And the larger the group, the harder it is to achieve consensus. But from my experience, organizations that adopt consensus, they fall back to majority rule when consensus is not moving forward. So I feel like the three methodologies kind of feed on each other. Also, as far as Robert's Rules of Order, if someone has an amendment to the bylaws, or they have a motion that is connected to harm, there is a kind of another motions for these, like one that they call I rise to the question of privilege, when there is actual harm or insult that is associated with emotion, then you kind of can interrupt the process and object to what's going on. So I feel like there is a different version of what each can do, and sometimes they end up relying on each other. Like when consensus is not achievable, it basically falls back to majority rule. Otherwise, you're not going to move forward if there is objections that you cannot remove. What's your feeling about that? Do you feel that?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that speaks to a issue of consensus. I mean, if you were trying to include every voice, and then you switch into voting, voting is still very, very important, because obviously to get a vote to pass, you have to find people who are passionate about that idea, which doesn't happen in consensus. Sometimes in consensus, there's something no one's passionate about. Again, look at any sort of international agreement. But there's, but you have to convince people to come onto your side. So that's good. But then that's not really consensus. That's just you're just voting. So in sociocracy, you don't go back to voting. And even there are specific roles in sociocracy, and there's a set way in which those roles are selected for, where people nominate someone based off of the qualities that the groups comes up with that are important to them, in addition to that job description. And oftentimes it's somebody who may not have ever put themselves forward or imagined themselves doing the role, and then they're proposed to do the role, and then often then they'll say, yeah, I'll accept if you can train me to go and do this or understand this. So there's that, but there's also the question of conflicts within groups, and what do groups stand for, and what are we actually doing together. And there's that great phrase, culture eats strategy for breakfast. A lot of groups have number one reason why people leave groups is because the culture is kind of hostile. And how this culture, how you address the culture question is really like, how much do you know people? How much are people working together? Are you guys united on what this group is supposed to be about? And one element that kind of confuses me with how consensus moves into voting is consensus is a big element of that is like we're addressing conflict through people all getting to kind of share. And then in voting, you work together despite conflict. There's tons of conflict in any board or whatever government agency. They use Robert's Rules of Order. They just move on. The sociocracy too is a way to work together despite these tensions, but it also kind of addresses the tension and the conflict thing by giving people a chance to better understand one another. When people get that their own space put out to share, you have people who don't normally share who are sharing. People feel like every bit of something is something they've contributed to, but also you have these kind of check-ins and outs and meetings that are like containers, where people are getting to kind of share how they're coming into a space, for example. So like, I am sorry, I got my kid here, so I'm going to maybe a little bit distracted, during this call. So people aren't like, oh, they're a jerk, they're not making eye contact with me. Oh, I understand what's going on in that situation. So when you collaborate a little bit closer, you get to know people better, and then people aren't nearly as scary or whatever. Oftentimes, our judgments of people based off of first interactions are not very accurate, And when you know people, you develop trust with them. It sticks you to the group. You get that stickiness. And then you don't want to do things too upset with them. And then when there is a conflict, you have an incentive to work through that conflict, to share your feelings honestly, to have a conversation with the person. I think you ask a lot of married couples, and you're just like, when there's a fight, like, well, that's something they try to work through it. You don't just have a fight with somebody and then be like, that's it, I'm getting divorced. That you have an incentive to work through that. Friendships have an incentive for you to sit down with that person when you have a disagreement and work through it. And so sociocracy is a structure enabling that in organizations.
I'm going to ask you some practical questions now, and then if we have enough time, we hope that we can keep this under 60 minutes. But if we have time, we'll go to even some of the more even practical applications of this in regards to what both of us are active in, which is the Green Party. But let's say, for example, there's a group in Dearborn that wants to adopt sociocracy in forming its group. Give us a breakdown, and you're a trainer. Give us, I know that this takes more time, but give us a sample, a breakdown of what are the small steps that they have to take using sociocracy to actually create the group and move forward.
Well, yeah. Well, a big thing with that is they would have to first start out by writing down everything the group kind of does. Like, okay, so how big is your group to begin with? If your group is 10 people, you can have one, it's very, very easy to start with just one circle that's making a few big decisions together, and then as you grow with people splitting off into smaller circles that take pieces of that broader decision. But also just you have that whole list of whatever your organization does, what goes together. Okay, what element of this is related to money? What element of this is related to people management? What element of this is related to maybe you're advocating for a certain policy, working with other people who are conducting outreach to other people who are experts in that policy or also fighting for it. It's in putting like things together and then seeing who's passionate about different things. And having them work together on a group. I will say too, I'm not here representing Sociocracy for All, but there is but Sociocracy for All has put out a book called Who Decides Who Decides, and it basically provides the structure for those first free meetings. It's a web book, it's like free. So it's very simple to just take that and then, have your decisions, have those first free meetings, get people to say kind of like, okay, we are members. This is how we feel about what our group should be doing. This is what our aims and domains are. So those would be the basis of that. But a big thing of sociocracy too is that it's the same people working together. So you want to have a sense of defined membership. Who are the people who are participating in this, and who are the people who just come to our events, every once in a while. If I run a DJ company, the people who would be involved in my sociocratic structure are the DJs, the promoters, the people who set up things. Maybe we may want to have a circle with some of the clubs we work with a lot, but somebody who comes to a DJ set isn't going to be involved in my sociocratic structure. So looking at who is relevant and important, and getting a sense of your members and getting a sense of the members of each of those pieces of the broader whole.
So they create they define their aim, they define their goals, they define the different areas that they're going to work on, and then they divide themselves into circles. These circles can overlap, right?
So you can kind of think about it like a pizza. Like when all the circles come together, that's the whole organization. When you put all the slices back on that weird metal tin, you'll have the full circle again if no one's ate one. But people are taking pieces of that. But one element we haven't talked about yet with sociocracy is there's this center circle, and that is called a coordination circle. And what that does is that holds everything that hasn't been distributed out. And that also holds decisions that affect every single group. So before we were kind of talking about objecting when something is beyond the aim of a group. Like if the whole group is all of a sudden going to change its name or adopt a new mascot or something, or you have a Dearborn based group and all of a sudden you're like, you know what, this should be a group that focuses on all of Michigan. Those conversations, that's something that goes into that kind of center circle. And indeed, when these subcircles get bigger than 10, 11, 12 people, or have a lot of different specializations, like a medium messaging circle having Instagram and Facebook and things like that have different skill sets attached to them, they have their own subcircles that they come out. So another big piece of Sociocracy is that the circles are linked together through this web, through internal coordinators and external coordinators. So internal coordinators being people who go and, delegates and leaders is another way to do it. Different organizations use different words. And so there's somebody who's kind of like the project manager holding the circle together, checking in with members. Hey, we're going to have a meeting coming up. And then there's somebody who sits on that next broader circle. And a really important thing there is the person who's that kind of delegate or external coordinator, whatever, who sits on the next broader circle. They're chosen for their ability to work on that circle. But they go and they tell people what their circle's doing. Like, hey, my circle, our Instagram circle is doing this. That's what we're doing. And then the leader brings down what is happening. And they say, okay, so we heard that the medium messaging circle wants to put out a new set of key messages. So we need to start talking about on Instagram, these 3 elements of climate resilience. So there's that element to it too. But there's also some groups tend to have a strategy circle or a mission circle, and that's something that kind of holds the mission for the group and looks outward, so that center circle can look inward.
Mm-hmm. And so after they do this, just a question: can there be an overlapping and like if I'm a member of one circle, can I be a member of other circles?
Yeah, typically in some groups there are. Obviously, if we were like a bakery or something like that, and you worked, on the front end of things, you probably wouldn't be involved in a circle that, dealt with what the recipes were, but they would communicate with you, in other ways through seeking feedback and advice and through that kind of center circle, or maybe through a broader circle that just focuses on the store operations, not the business operations. So there is that. They're typically not everyone's a member of this center circle. Again, it's just that 10, 12 people. It's just the people who are the different delegates and leaders. But other than that, yeah, you can be part of different.
Okay. So Henry, so that's the structure. It seems like Sociocracy presents a lot of the structure of the organization. And I like the delegation into the circles, and empowering them to act autonomously. But as far as mechanics in the meeting, you said that when there is a motion or proposal, everyone's given an opportunity to say their opinion about it. Of course, someone can skip, right?
So someone can skip, but oftentimes when people skip in a meeting, one is because they feel like their opinion doesn't matter. And again, that's why these vested membership isn't important. We are. You are a member of this. You are important. You're a stakeholder. What you have to say is important. And two, they're just like out of the blue, like, oh, I'm going to call on you now. What do you think? And someone's like, whoa, I wasn't prepared. Maybe I was, daydreaming, or maybe I was just still thinking about what that next person said. So a lot of that is sorted through rounds where people know when they're going to go and they feel like their voice is valued. So skipping is actually quite rare, but it does happen. They can skip.
And does this take a lot of time? Like if you have a large group, let's say of 20 or a board of 30 members, like, I mentor student governments, and there are, 30 to 60 members in every board in the legislative assembly. It would be impossible to have everyone, give their opinion. Usually, according to Robert Rules of Order, everyone has an opportunity to speak, and they have an opportunity to speak before anyone gets a second chance. So that kind of guarantees that everyone has that opportunity. They get recognized by the chair, and they get the platform to speak, so no one voice or personality has an effect on actually stating someone's opinion. But that's not going to be practical in sociocracy, right?
No, so like sociocracy is not for like a
Larger groups.
Well, it's for larger groups. I mean, there are groups of people. I mean, if anyone's ever familiar with companies like Zappos or Patagonia or something, these are companies of 10, 20,000, people. They have discrete teams and groups, and they break themselves up in that way.
Mhm.
But Steam being another one, the video game releasing company. So it can be for bigger groups, but it's not for something where your membership is because you were elected by a constituency, like a city council or something. Everyone needs to be in that meeting because every part of the city needs to be represented, because every single, if it's a proportional system, every single party, needs that got in, needs its person there. So it doesn't work in that sense, but it works for, corporations, nonprofits, movements, and intentional communities, things like that. But the really important thing about what the facilitator does is they're not just like calling on people and things like that. They're putting the order in, and you do this kind of sequence of questions, reactions. The facilitator modifies this proposal based on those reactions, and then the consent round. And it's just the simple structures, those 3 rounds. If you're doing something that is a policy, so involving multiple decisions, like this is how we deal with excess petty cash or something like that, it can be a little bit more complex, and there's scoping rounds with like dimensions and needs that it must address and things like that. But at the core, it's just that. So oftentimes decision takes between 5 minutes to 20 minutes, depending on how complex the topic is.
So does the facilitator, when he changes or she changes the proposal based on the feedback, do they go back and get everyone's opinion on the changed proposal?
No, they say, does everyone understand how I changed that proposal? And, so if there's somebody who doesn't understand, we may do, if they look out and everyone's like, we may do a round of just clarifying questions. What was your questions on how the proposal was changed?
Or someone is not in agreement with that change?
Well, that's not about agreement or not. That's just about understanding what you're deciding on. So if we have a decision to add vanilla extract into our bread, and I modified the proposal from this being, based on the reactions, people saying we needed something sweet in there. So I modified the proposal to add vanilla extract as facilitator. People are just saying like, did you say bourbon extract? Did you say almond? Like, no, I said vanilla extract. Was there a specific, brand to that? So people may ask those questions. But oftentimes, because the facilitator is restating the proposal, there's typically very few questions to understand it. But then the chance for how you feel about that proposal is then that consent round. Is this something that's good enough for now, safe enough to try? And oftentimes, the proposal is, because the facilitator is a member of your group. It's someone you've selected from your group. They want to see the group succeed. They don't want to do anything that's harmful. They want to incorporate as much of the feedback from what's happened as possible. They want to do a good job, and you can always object. And when you object, it's not like in some consensus situations where someone's like, I object, and everyone's like, oh my God, oh great, that's the end of this. Instead, people are like, ooh, like they're on the edge of their seat, like, okay, well, how can we make this proposal better? Like we're going to have something that's more complex, more effective, more wonderful, because you're objecting. Because you're not objecting to stop the process. You're objecting to make the process better. But yeah, so that chance is with the consent round.
Yeah, interesting. I haven't really experienced that firsthand. I've seen other models, by the way, when I was in the Islamic traditional work in the Islamic seminary. We had a different kind of decision making. it is, I feel when I'm hearing sociocracy, it kind of bringing memories of that environment where there is a person who's assigned. He's kind of like assigned as a leader. He has the experience, has been chosen by the group or by a higher circle to be the leader. And then basically he or she asks every member of the group about their opinion. Sometimes he doesn't ask every member, he asks specific number of members. There's a lot of trust in the process, and then he makes a decision based on everyone's feedback and to the best of his ability. So there is a lot of emphasis on the leader and a lot of trust in the leader. Of course, that's not the same thing as sociocracy, but I feel like the facilitator in sociocracy plays a more important role than the chairman in Robert Rules of Order, or the also called facilitator in the consensus process. Although the consensus process really lacks mechanism, it's more of a style of reaching a decision, and it lacks all the mechanism. So if Robert Rules of Order is 1,000 pages, consensus is 1 page out of those 1,000 pages. And that's why I feel when it comes to meetings, there's a lot of, I can ask, we're out of time, but I can ask you a set of questions. It's kind of translating, right? It's like different languages of facilitation. So I can ask you, we do this in Robert Rules of Order, how do we do it in sociocracy? And then how do we do it in consensus? To translate all these mechanics. There are a lot of these mechanics. Like, for example, if you want to bring back a proposal that has been voted on, something new was revealed to you, you want to bring it back. How does this happen in sociocracy? I know how this happens in Robert's Rules of Order. It requires 2/3 votes to bring it back. How does it happen in sociocracy? Just as an example.
Yeah, well, a lot of times, we think about decisions in two ways. There's decisions that are one-off. What are we going to eat tonight? What kind of food is going to be served at our event? That's not for example, something that would often come back. If the grape juice wasn't a hit, next time we have a decision about what kind of food we were going to serve at the event, people are obviously going to bring that up, but the grape juice has been drunk, it's over with. And then there's decisions that affect, multiple things, like we're going to be part of this broader coalition, or we're going to do this when this situation happens. And with those things, there are terms. So after a set amount of time, you review it, and you place those things on backlogs. Typically on agenda documents, we just let know, okay, we're going to go back to this at a certain time. But then if there's issues, oftentimes that's something that is communicated. And they're like, hey, I know we're supposed to review this in 3 months, but this is not really working at all. And so people can move that in, back onto agendas as well. And the great thing here is that groups evaluate the agenda. The one of the jobs of leaders to ask people, what do we want to talk about this week? What are we working on? Things like that, and to harvest those different agenda items ahead of time. Also, people consent to the agenda at the start of the meeting. So if there's something on there that really should be on there's something on there that is just totally incorrect, somebody can object when you consent to that agenda. So there's those mechanisms in place. But another big part of this that we haven't gotten to is roles and things like that. And it's people who have a codified bit of that domain that and they can make their own decisions there, and they're following that advice process. So a lot of this is very proactive, where things are because these situations are dealt with in advance of meetings, and because there's more communication and trust, those things aren't brought up. The meeting isn't the only place where those sorts of things can happen. And so then by the time you get to the meeting and you have these decisions, there's a lot more of a deeper perspective that emerges.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's at least this conversation will start people thinking of different styles of running organizations. I don't think that many organizations put thought into that. I have a personal experience of doing a lot of work without adopting a method for reaching decision making. And that is a nightmare. And due to that, I have emphasized throughout my, I don't know, my active years, I have emphasized Robert Rules of Order as a methodology. I knew that other methods are available, but I just picked the one that has been, a proven record of success in running democratic societies. And I've even placed it as one of the values that, in the Universal Declaration for Human Values, as one of the values of building a modern, humane, society, because it kind of pushes forward the idea of a democratic decision making. Nevertheless, it is not a perfect model or mechanism. We've seen today that our whole democratic system is lacking the delivery of the basic premises on which our democracy is built. So that makes us question how can we always improve, and how can we question some of the methodologies that we're using. So thank you, Henry, for bringing Sociocracy to the Arab American Center for Culture and Arts, for Dearborn blog, Dearborn listeners, and all the other channels that this is being broadcast on. I hope that this name is now more familiar to anyone who hears this episode, and it will make them think and present that question to any organization they work with to consider that. For example, I, as a mentor of student government in a group of schools, I will be bringing this idea to them, telling them that, I will motion to have the parliamentarian present a summary of the different methods that student government maybe should consider or should be aware of in continuing their work. They now use Robert Rules of Order, but they should be familiar with other methodologies. Also, I want to say that these things are combinable. You can take some good things from this, some good things from that. You can write your own procedures, and I have a sense of urgency in everything I do in my life, and that's why I always lean towards whatever is more practical. I also, because I work with a diverse number of groups and organizations, I always feel that consensus is just is unreachable. I don't have a lot of hope in consensus. I always feel that there are perspectives that are built on very subjective and personal experiences that take a lot of time to actually enlighten those perspectives in a different way. And that's why this can be, for an urgent work, that can be a real obstacle. So, but I am learning from all the new experiences that I'm having, from all the new knowledge, and I hope our audience is too. Thank you, Henry, for your time. Any final words?
Just think about, like, it doesn't have to be Sociocracy, but just think about how connected your decision making is to the impact you hope to have, and know that there is a lot of help out there, because there are so many different people who grapple with these questions all the time, and there are so many different wonderful communities out there who are excited and would be willing to help you.
Thank you very much. The links to Sociocracy for All and also for Rebellion Global, I've placed in the comments. Please visit these sites if you're interested. Also, Henry's email is in the description of the video if you'd like to reach out personally to him for further information or questions. Thank you very much, and have a great night.